Historiography's Golden Age. Historiography reached its peak of prominence when a few powerful currents combined forces. The Philosophes had thrust a comprehensive interpretation of history into the midst of public discussions. At the same time, the historians of the German Aufklärung, somewhat less concerned with charting a common course for humanity, articulated an intricate body of methods designed to make possible accurate knowledge and an understanding Verstehen of past periods. Then the American and French revolutions introduced fundamental and rapid changes into Western culture. As the quest for knowing the meaning of the multitude of often puzzling events grew, people relied on historians to find explanations for the many changes, as well as the assurance of continuity and stability in the midst of change. Some historians searched past centuries for the origin, development, and nature of libertas. Others were captivated by the romantic concept of the nation as the spiritual unity of a people, and attempted to trace a nation's course through the ages. In either case, historians often left the quiet of the scholar's study to become counselors of rulers, guides for political parties, and articulators of the Volksgeist. Even those who remained simply scholars contributed to the enhancement of history's prominence by their contributions to a historical science. Historians did not quite replace the philosophers and the theologians, but in many ways they surpassed them in influence, as the educated became used to calling on historiography to interpret human life, or at least to aid in approaching most problems historically. Historians as public figures. One could have thought that the ancient period had returned, as history writing and public service once more were frequently linked. In France, Thiers and Guizot served King Louis Philippe as minister and prime minister, while the famous poet Alphonse M.C. Lamartine planned his History of the Girondists, conceived as history but excluded as a novel, to discredit the monarchy of Louis Philippe. He briefly became a prominent figure in the Revolution of 1848. Most other French historians had ties to one another, or the other of the political groups, and Thiers and Manet began their careers as journalists in order to influence public opinion. Conversely, historians suffered for their commitment through dismissals from archival and academic positions. When the political power constellation shifts, for example, Manet and Michelet, and through exile, Quinet and Thiers, few preserved as well as Thiers, who in old age became the first president of the Third Republic. Bismarck considered some German historians essential figures in the creation of the German Empire of 1781. Their public commitment, however, differed from that of their French colleagues. In the 1830s, Ranke did edit the Historische Politische Zeitschrift to plead the cause of the unique German Volksgeist and of the moderate conservatism with the educated public, and Gervinus edited a liberal periodical. But such journalistic ventures were rare for German historians, and equally so was Ranke's role as occasional advisor to two kings, Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia and Maximilian II of Bavaria. It mattered much that most German historians were professors at public universities. Despite considerable academic freedom, the stake of historians in the existing order and the aspirations of their state made cooperation between the existing powers and historians more characteristic for German historiography than acts of opposition. The outstanding example of the latter occurred in the 1830s, when 7 professors, including Dahlmann and Gervinus, protested against the Hanoverian kings of revocation of the Constitution. After the publication of his History of the 19th Century, Gervinus was tried for treason, while Dahlmann, who had joined the unsuccessful Frankfurt Parliament of 1848, hoping for a German liberal and national reconstruction, associated himself with the so-called Prussian school of historiography, which favored a German empire under Prussian leadership. On behalf of that cause, many historians spoke well and effectively. In England, the liaison between history writing and public life had always been firm, but had rarely been closer than in Macaulay's case. He was a fortunate man, since his sympathies, mode of work, and experiences all were in harmony with the prevailing Whig political philosophy of the day. being in tune with the prevailing spirit of one's nation was also characteristic of the American historians of the pre-Civil War period, although with the exception of Bancroft, they had little direct involvement in public life. Macaulay and the narrative American historians were not professors who wrote mainly for a small circle of scholars. They wished for their often many-volumed works to reach the people, and therefore strove for eloquence and dealt with issues which concerned the public. The people, of course, meant the lay public, which through public education was growing steadily. Guizot thought that readers or listeners required light and life together, and they wished to be illuminated and excited, instructed and amused. Notwithstanding the subsequent disapproval by the so-called scientific historians of such literary history, 19th century historians could not write in any other way if they wished to reach their goals. Even Ranke, never intent on promoting a cause, strove for a narrative with dramatic highlights, sharp characterization of persons, and a steady flow. He succeeded as a writer, but not as a lecturer. His lecture audiences, except during the 1830s, were extremely small. In that respect, he stood in sharp contrast to Heinrich Treitschke, whom the Berlin University faculty picked to succeed Ranke precisely in order to link history and public life more directly, or, in other words, to do justice to those circles of students who seek instruction in history for other purposes than to dedicate themselves exclusively to the study of history and historical research. Treitschke fulfilled this hope, and his work became an enthusiastic affirmation of the German nation and its past from the perspective of its new standing in Europe. The German historical science. Ranke had already instilled the code of V.S. Eigentlich Gewesen in dozens of young historians when Macaulay still celebrated English liberty in his work, and Guizot wrote a work which originated in the paternal pleasures of telling my grandchildren the history of France. German historiography had rushed ahead of the rest of European historiography in methodological sophistication. Only in the 1860s would the meditation of Gabriel Monod facilitate the transfer of German methods to France, while the German mode of doing history influenced the idiosyncratic English development through the so-called Oxford and Cambridge schools of historiography, and then American historiography through the numerous Americans who studied at German universities. The German historical seminars were training grounds for missionaries of the Geschichte Wissenschaft, and the German historical works were its missionary tracts. Yet the view of German historical science is simply the culmination of the critical historiography that began with Renaissance humanism in Italy. A sort of saturated erudition cannot explain the great controversies over that historical science in the late 19th century, conflicts which were more philosophical than methodological in nature. The issue was the idealist ingredient in that science, which interpreted historical phenomena in terms of the divine, or the divine's mediators, the ideas, and saw the world of persons and institutions as marked by uniqueness and development. 19th century rulers and governments found such a historical interpretation, with its clear negation of abstract ideals and radical change, congenial. On the other hand, the idealist basis made the Ranckean historical science vulnerable to attack once another philosophical base was chosen. Up to the late 19th century, the late 1880s, a supreme confidence stilled all doubts. History no longer was the servant of any other discipline. It had come into its own, complete with ancillary disciplines and a methodology. The latter revealed both its promise and its limits. The desire to reconstruct accurately and fully all of past life tended to widen the scope of sources continuously, with the new science of epigraphy supplying the prominent example. Niebuhr had pioneered the use of inscriptions of Roman history. Bach had done the same for Greek inscriptions, while Theodor Mommsen enhanced the knowledge of Roman inscriptions. The demand that every historical work be based on the critical use of documents, a procedure Ranke did not originate but made mandatory, led students into the archives, where they promptly learned about much of politics, diplomacy, law, and a few social phenomena. Many of the sources for economic history, intellectual, artistic, and religious history, however, could not be encountered in the state archives, and this circumstance, combined with the preoccupation of the age with politics in the grand style, worked to the detriment of these fields. Also, when the historians emerged from the archives, many of them found the apparatus of scholarship and the mindset of the erudite scholars formidable obstacles to achieving eloquence. While gifted historians still succeeded in exciting their readers, pedantry crept into their historical works. One period of the past gained especially from the new scholarship, with archives full of medieval documents and with the age filled with romantic notions of Volksgeist. German historians began to bring to light the Middle Ages when, as they thought, the German spirit had manifested itself in a brilliant empire. On their part, some French historians searched the Middle Ages for the traces of libertas, the growth of the Third Estate, and the role of kings, while the English retained their strong interest in the classical age and gave intermittent attention to the medieval period. English historians were fascinated by the Anglo-Saxons in the Middle Ages, particularly in the context of exploring the seemingly constant struggle between crown and parliament. In all countries, a strong desire grew to rescue the remains of the nation's past by collecting, editing, and publishing source materials. This romantic nationalist dedication to the past produced brilliant text editions. Students were trained to judge and use sources in historical seminars and special institutes, such as the École des Chartes, which Guizot had furthered, and the Österreichisches Institut für Geschichtsforschung. In these circumstances, medieval studies flourished, achieving results that have altered our ideas about Western history profoundly. Amidst the celebration of the successes of the new critical history, nobody noticed that historiography had arrived at one of its turning points. The view of historical knowledge as cumulative, with scholars contributing their small share to it, excluded historians whose methods had not been fully developed. All histories created prior to the early 19th century had become tainted, and they all had to be done over again in the proper manner. They offered at best source material that could be consulted for bits of information here or there, but had to be rejected as valid history. As a consequence, one not perceived by the German historical scholars and their allies, the value and authority of all older historiographical models and all histories based on them began to vanish. Paradoxically, Geschichtswissenschaft had the same corrosive effect on traditional historiography as did the advocacy of the elusive and exclusive use of the natural science model for the explanation of human phenomena. Historical scholarship in a young nation. The enthusiasm for history shown by 19th century Americans equaled that shown by the Europeans. The two different continents differed considerably, however, in their historiographical endeavors. Americans as well had their publications of sources, but these were not sustained by monarchical or princely subsidies, and by a strong contingent of historical scholars drawn from the academic community. Instead, the historical societies formed by states, regions, and localities assumed the task of collecting, preserving, and publishing source materials. Such a society began in Massachusetts as early as the year 1791, and by the year 1860, there existed over 100 such societies. A few scholarly entrepreneurs also did their share in preserving the documentary heritage of the nation, such as Jared Sparks, who published 47 volumes of sources, including the writings of George Washington. Prominent among those who formed and sustained the historical societies were lawyers, clergymen, doctors, teachers, and gentlemen of means. They shared an immense pride in the new nation and its steady development. The nation's past as well as its future destiny were clear to them. The United States had been created as the ideal defender of the ideal liberty in the ongoing struggle between the forces of liberty and its opponents. The remains of the American past were the witnesses up to that struggle, and needed to be preserved so that they could teach and inspire future generations. In publishing these sources, editors needed therefore to be accurate but also sympathetic. The strict critical editorial standards of contemporary German historiography had no measurable influence on American editors of documents. Sparks, for example, still corrected George Washington's grammar, spelling, and sentence structure because such editing seemed to do no harm to accuracy and also enhanced the didactic and inspirational use of the documents. From about 1870 onwards, the new standards of critical text editions and interpretations were taught in graduate programs in history at universities. Up to that time, history had a strong position in high schools, but a precarious status on the college level. Since 1643, when Harvard College began to offer a Historia Civis, some occasional teaching of history as a separate subject occurred. In the 1830s, for example, Jared Sparks lectured on the American Revolution at Harvard, and in the 1850s, history appeared at the University of Michigan. Academic history grew from then on. Thus, throughout most of the 19th century, history was not a professional endeavor of academicians. Although it had a clear didactic purpose, whether the subject matter was American, ancient, or world history, the historian was to provide information and educate, democratic citizens. The historiography of the years between 1870 and 1914 could best be compared to a section of ocean whose tranquil surface was increasingly disturbed by the effects of swift and turbulent undercurrents. On the surface, the golden age of historiography continued to the First World War. The discipline of history was well represented at the universities, the historical approach pervaded other disciplines, and the still largely unbroken tradition helped maintain a confident historical sense. A constant stream of works on political, military, and diplomatic history poured forth, reflecting and affirming the preoccupations of the world of nation-states. That type of historical writing fit with the contemporary historical science and also served well the European power system that was temporarily at an equilibrium. Germany and Italy had achieved national unity. France had settled on the republican form of government. The United States had become one nation free of slavery, and England continued on a steady course as a world power. All of them were exuberantly expansionist in scope and seemed to have gained access to perennial power, to be able to assure an ever-increasing well-being for more and more of their citizens, and to have reached a stable compromise between tradition and innovation. Yet four broad forces, science, industrialization, the emancipation of the masses, and the emergence of a global world, were already reshaping contemporary life. Historiography was affected also because since the 1700s, it increasingly undertook the ambitious task of reconstructing the past without any aid from existing traditions. That, by necessity, involved historians in formulating their own philosophical explanations of the world's order and the methods of finding that order. Thus, the proliferation of philosophical explanations for the world had a marked impact on historiography. The latter had exchanged the limits put on it by tradition and religion for an unlimited freedom of explanation. It proved a complex but often troublesome exchange. By 1880, the sciences enjoyed immense prestige. Many scholars of the late 19th century were enthusiastic about the image of a non-mysterious world without essences and spiritual entities, and about the scientific method as a way to ascertain certain and timeless truth. The public was impressed by science's offspring, technology, with its promises of more food, products, health, comfort, and mobility. Not surprisingly, scholars in all fields, including history, felt impelled to emulate so successful an endeavor and transfer its views and methods from the inquiry into nature to the inquiry into human phenomena. Historians soon too found that historiography could not simply be made to conform to the natural science model by undergoing a few adaptations here and there. They would have to accept not only the research methods, but also the basic views of the world of the sciences. And again, since history is not demonstrable, it cannot be repeated over and over again. It is an art, not a science, and it has to study, carefully analyze documents. The emulation of strict scientific empiricism, however, would exact a high price by dislodging from dominance the unique phenomena and their idiosyncratic contexts, and putting in their place general and predictable phenomena or forces. Historians would then have to abandon indeterminism in favor of determinism. This explains why the 6 decades prior to 1914, an increasingly fierce battle raged between those who were ready to make the change, such as Auguste Comte, Henry Buckle, Karl Lamprecht, and some American historians, and those who opposed historiography's absorption into a unified science. Among the latter were the large majority of historians who found the methods of history that had been developed earlier in the 19th century fully adequate to ensure the scientific standing of history. They, as George M. Trevelyan put it bluntly, considered the idea of history becoming a science harmful, if not extremely grotesque. In the late 19th century, even German scholars grew aware of a precarious situation in the German historical science that had been brought about when Ranke's successors had discarded the philosophical and theological elements the master had used in his synthesis. But Ranke's system had gained its persuasive power from the correspondence between form, methods, and the perceived order of the world, stable, divinely ordered, and of course with ideas as mediators between the transcendent and the mundane. The scholars also understood that historians under the obligation to reconstruct the past, but having left only the modern version of erudition and the narrative form, to master the task could no longer avoid speculating on the nature of the world, particularly on its human phenomena. While in the ancient and medieval periods, history's limited purpose required only a methodology equally limited in sophistication, The ambitious ideal of reconstructing the past independent of and often against traditional views of the historian's society now demanded an elaborate methodological and epistemological apparatus. Historians who truly stripped themselves of all traditional views, seen as prejudices, had to reconstruct the world from scratch on the basis of sources and a philosophical explanation of the world as a substitute for tradition. But the resulting multitude of views would threaten the truth value of history, and that in turn prompted an agonizing struggle to ward off the specter of relativism. Positivist historians, who were sure of the world's nature and the methods for its study, had, of course, no such problems. Positivist historians, relying on a scientific explanation of the world that drew on Ranke, as well as Newton, Comte, and Darwin, saw the problem simply as one of using appropriately scientific methods in their research. They took an ambivalent stand on the existing traditions, most importantly religion. Mostly employed by public institutions, they left unsaid, often unthought, that science knew neither a fatherland nor cultural preferences. They also continued to adhere to, or even affirm, national traditions and the progress view of the Enlightenment period. The industrial age discovers the real force in history. The age of the machine had begun for many Western countries centuries ago, but in the second half of the 19th century, industrialization proceeded at a staggering pace and triggered changes vast in number and in scope. Factories and cities grew in tandem, destination points of a migration from the countryside that dwarfed the famous Germanic migrations. These migrants saw the industrial cornucopia as a promise of betterment for all. The hardships and sufferings caused by long and hard work at low pay were real, but so were improvements and a hope for a steadily growing affluence in which even the masses would share. By mid-century, economic activities were perceived as sufficiently important for few German historians to create economic history, although they held fast to the view that economic forces were only one component in a field of many forces. Their restraint was shattered, however, by a man by the name of Karl Marx, who, inspired by Wilhelm Hegel, built a historical theory on a grand scale. Critics pointed out that with its strict determinism and its prediction of a historyless ideal and end stage, the theory was destructive to the existing social order, to empirical research, and to a truly historical view of the world. By the late 19th century, a process of revision and interpretation began in an attempt to adjust Karl Marx's historical theory to the fullness of life. As for non-Marxist economic studies, they took a completely ahistorical turn when, in the late 1800s, economics began its spectacular rise as a science based on the assumption of a pure homo economicus, or timeless mechanisms, and the isolation of the economic sphere from all other human phenomena. Economic history as a field remained weakened by the defections of Marxists and the new economists, but a general assertion of economic forces as dominant pervaded not a few subsequent historical works, particularly some by historians of the American New History School. The masses at the gates of historiography, the industrial workers of Europe, found in Marxism a rallying point, but their march to equality was enhanced by their sheer numbers, improving education and concentration in the urban areas, as well as by the willingness of some societies to ameliorate hardships. When the age of the masses began, somewhere in the late 19th century, historians were hardly prepared for it. So far, peasants and workers had gotten little attention in historical works. Theirs had been an anonymous presence marked by no more than the routine cycles of birth, growth, work, marriage, reproduction, illness, and death. Intermittently, the common people had revolted or had been victims of catastrophes, and on those occasions had received brief mention. Even when 19th century historians spoke of the people, they usually referred to distinct collectives, the nations, who found their proper acknowledgement in national histories. Their access to the story of the common people was blocked by the types of sources that they consulted, which were mainly diplomatic, political, and military records. Undoubtedly, most historians were also among the supporters of the existing order in Western societies prior to 1914, and were suspicious of the masses. Thus, institutional histories dealt with the development of social roles, rules, and customs that held society together. Only Marxists celebrated industrial workers as the great antithesis to capitalist societies that in the end would transform those societies themselves. However, orthodox Marxism as well defined the common people as a group with given characteristics. The empirical study of the masses took only tentative steps in the decades prior to 1914. John Green's celebrated History of the English People did no more than replace political and military history with cultural history. It was in the United States, however, during the Progressive period, that the first democratically oriented historiography appeared in the works of the New History School. The triumphant West and its world histories. The world had been known to be a globe since 1522, but only by the late 19th century did the global world become a part of everyday life. Accordingly, the need to write world history should have grown more and more urgent, but it did not. In fact, as long as the flags of Western countries still flew over vast expanses of the globe, those areas remained essentially appendages to Europe, and therefore the past of such places as Africa and Asia was mainly treated in the context of colonial and imperial histories. For Marxists, world history was simply a generalized Western experience with its perceived development proceeding toward the eternal socialist communist stage. Many religious scholars, however, were severely handicapped because their theological higher criticism and empirical archaeology put essential parts of their traditional universal history into extreme doubt. Those who wished for world histories based on new images of human life and the world were not successful either. Darwinians proved little more than a general suggestion of evolution as the developmental model for world history. The view of human beings as purely biological entities and primate apes yielded the basis for racial histories, and the concept of the survival of the fittest, turned by that of Henry Spencer, served other historians as the justification of imperial ventures. That left a few scholars who simply studied civilizations comparatively, while putting aside the question of a truly unitary world history. In sum, total. At its peak of world dominance, Western culture betrayed little firm grasp or keen analysis of world history, together with much uncertainty, doubt, and confusion. Some historians would take that as a reflection of an insufficiently developed database, while others were moved to describe decay.